Chapter 8. This is going to be Part 2, Labor, Material, and Overhead Standards. Now, I'm doing these just like your homework, but there are a number of ways you can do these calculations, but I want you to do your homework right, so that's what I'm going to follow. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do is we're going to look how standards are developed. Now, normally we've in the past talked about a budget, which is for total cost, but a standard is how we determine what we estimate is the cost of one unit. Now, the reason we do this is because it really helps us see what's going on when we make and sell a product. So, standard costs, they're preset costs for delivering a product or service. Under normal, they're not the perfect standard, they're not normal circumstances. Based on an expected level of performance, and manufacturers use these standards for direct material, direct labor, and overhead costs. Now, we have three different types of variances, and all of them we're going to look at the same thing. The first is the cost variance, which is the difference between the actual and the standard cost, whether it's material or labor. We then have the actual cost. If it's less than the standard cost, it's going to be a favorable variance, i.e. we spent less than we thought we were going to. If the actual is greater than the standard cost, then it's going to be unfavorable, because what's happened? We spent more than we expected. So let's first determine the total cost variance. Now, I always like to do this if I work a problem where I'm looking at all three variances, materials, labor, and overhead, because I now know what number I have to have and know that all my answers are correct. So let's take a look first at the formula. Now, I know we use these initials, but that's just how it works with these. So, we have the actual quantity, which is the actual amount of direct materials or labor used to manufacture the actual quantity of output. We have the standard quantity, which is the standard amount of input for the actual quantity of output. Then we have the actual prices, what's how much we've actually paid for labor and materials. And then we have the standard prices, what we thought we were going to pay. Now, here is a problem, and I've tried to give you all the information you need. And one of the things you need, first of all, is you need to know the actual units produced, which we show as 47,700. We also need to know, because we're doing fixed overhead, we need to know the number of direct labor hours it's based on, because remember, fixed costs normally don't change regardless of the change in the amount of units produced within the relevant range. Then we're going to look at our actual costs. How much did we actually spend? So now we can look at this. So what we're going to do is we know what our actual costs were. So now let's figure out what it should have cost based on our standards. So the direct material is what it should have cost us is based on our standard rate per unit times the number of units we produced. It should have cost $7,011,900. For the direct labor, based on our estimated $64 per unit, and that is based on 4 hours per unit at $16 an hour. And then we have our overhead, which is going to be 24 plus 40, which is our total of 60, times the 47,700 units, and that gives us our 3,052,800, and we have our total, what the standard was. And this doesn't look good, because if you look at this, the total standard cost is much less than the actual cost. And the difference is unfavorable based on $2,399,900 unfavorable. Now what we want to know is how did we end up so unfavorable? Is it because of the materials, the labor, or the overhead? Now, when we get done, our three variances must equal 2,399,900 unfavorable. So now we'll first look at our direct material and direct labor variances. There are two main factors that cause material and labor variances. One is we pay more or less than what we should have, or we use more or less than we should have. That's really what this whole formula comes down to. Now, the purchasing department is responsible for the price paid for materials. The purchasing manager might have found lower cost materials or had to pay more because of higher prices or higher quality materials. The production department is responsible for the quantity of direct materials used. The production department might have used more than the standard amount of materials, maybe because of low quality materials, or they could have ended up using less because the new materials work better. And that has the same to do with labor. They could have paid more or less for the labor or used more or less of the labor. Now, let's look at first we're going to do our material variance. So, the way to do your material balance, you first look at what did it actually cost us. So, it's going to be the actual quantity times the actual price per unit. So, in this case, we used 1,412 pounds times $7.70 per pound. And we spent a total of $10,872,400 right there. Now we're going to look at the actual quantity times the standard price. So we're going to again use our 1,412 pounds, but we're going to take it times the standard cost, which gives us a total of $6,918,800. Then we're going to look at the standard cost. Now this is going to be based on the standard quantity based on the units produced times the standard price. So to get that, we're going to take the number of units times 30 pounds per unit, and that gives us 1,431,000 pounds times 490, which is the standard. And we get 7,011,900. Now let's consider what is the price variance, i.e., we spent $10,872,400, but it should have cost us $6,918,800, so we have an unfavorable variance. So if we spend more than we thought we were going to, it's going to be unfavorable. Now the quantity variance. In this case, we used less materials than we budgeted, and in that case we have a favorable variance because we used less. But unfortunately it doesn't offset that we paid a lot more, almost twice. So what ends up happening here is we have a total material variance unfavorable of $3,860,500. Now let's go on to our labor variance. Now remember, in the homework they don't use brackets for unfavorable, although I think it makes it easier to understand if you did. But they don't, so don't get messed up on that. It's that little stuff that messes you up on that homework. Now let's take a look at the direct labor variance. So first we're going to look at the actual hours times the actual rate. And we get the 2,043,800, which is shown up here. Then we're going to compare the actual hours times the standard, and we get 185,500 times 16, And then we're going to take our standard cost, which is the standard hours times the standard rate. Now, how did we get that 190,800? Well, we took the units actually produced times the standard, that should be hours per unit, which gives us 190,800 hours. So, for the rate variance, we have a favorable of 929 because we did pay less. And for efficiency, we actually, in spite of the fact we used cheaper labor, we were still more efficient. So we have a total of direct labor variance of 1,009,000 favorable, which is great, but that doesn't seem to set off that we spent more on materials. So let's see what happens with our overhead. Now, for the overhead variance, we have a controllable variance and a volume variance. So first, we take the actual total overhead, and we get that from over here. And then we take the budgeted total overhead. We first take the fixed part, and you always have to do that based on the hours it was estimated at $10 an hour. So, and they gave you that. They gave you the 169,900. And then we looked at the applied, which is also always going to be based on the actual units produced times the hours that we predicted we used times the rate we estimated. And that gives us our budgeted total overhead. And in this case, we spent less than we thought we were going to do. So that is favorable. Now for the volume variance, we're going to take our budgeted total overhead, which we get from right over there, and we're going to subtract out the standard overhead applied. How much did we actually apply? Well, it would have been the $64 times 47,700 units, because that's on a per unit basis. If we did it based on hours, we would have had to take the 16 times the 47,700 times 4 hours. You get the same answer. And we have a volume variance of 212,000 favorable. But do we have enough? No, obviously we don't. So now when we look at our total variance, we add up our direct material variance, our direct labor variance, and our overhead variance. So remember, if it's unfavorable, we have to subtract the favorable, and in this case we end up with unfavorable of 2,399,900, which was the same number that we got for the total variance when we did that at the beginning. So we have still have the unfavorable variance of 2,399,900, but we now know that that's primarily due that we paid almost twice what we should have for the materials. And that ends this presentation. I hope that helps you with your homework. This is done just like your homework.